had not spoken a single word in 11 months. Her hands were cracked and bleeding from digging graves in frozen ground with nothing but a rusted spade and sheer desperation. And when the lonely cowboy named William Tate found her collapsed beside a dead campfire in the November cold of 1879, 20 miles from the nearest settlement in Wyoming territory, she looked at him with eyes so hollow and haunted that he understood immediately this woman had witnessed something that had stolen not just her voice, but her very will to live. The widow wore a tattered black dress that hung on her skeletal frame like a burial shroud. Her feet were wrapped in blood-soaked rags that had once been part of a curtain, and the silence that surrounded her was so profound and terrible that when William dismounted and approached her, the sound of his boots on the frozen earth seemed like a violation of something sacred and broken. She did not flinch when he knelt beside her, did not react when he wrapped his coat around her shaking shoulders. And in that moment of perfect stillness, beneath a sky heavy with snow that had not yet begun to fall, William Tate made a choice that would transform him from a lonely cowboy riding the empty ranges into a marked man whose single act of mercy would be interpreted by an unforgiving West as something far darker and more dangerous. The widow could not tell him what had happened to her, could not explain the horror that had stolen her voice, but her silence spoke volumes to a territory that had already decided what it meant when a cowboy shared his fire with a woman whose reputation had been destroyed by circumstances no one cared to understand. And by the time the first snow began to fall that night, Eleanor Marsh and William Tate had become bound together in a story that the West would never forgive. If you are drawn to stories where simple acts of kindness become unforgivable sins in the eyes of a brutal world, subscribe now, because what happens next will test everything you believe about mercy and the terrible price of compassion in a land that mistakes gentleness for guilt. William Tate had been riding the circuit between cattle ranches for 6 years, a lonely cowboy who preferred the company of his horse and the vast silence of the Wyoming ranges to the noise and judgment of settlements. And in all that time, he had learned that the West was a place where a man's reputation could be his only currency and his greatest vulnerability. He was 34 years old, lean and weathered from years of outdoor labor, with the kind of quiet competence that made ranch owners trust him with their herds, and the kind of solitary nature that made other cowboys leave him alone. He had no family to speak of, no ties to any particular place, just an endless succession of seasonal work and lonely camps under stars that seemed to grow more distant with each passing year. The loneliness had become such a constant companion that William barely noticed it anymore, or perhaps he had simply learned to accept that some men were meant to walk through life alone. Their only comfort, the reliable rhythm of work, and the uncomplicated honesty of animals who did not judge or condemn. That November morning in 1879 had begun like any other, with William breaking camp before dawn and riding south toward the Medicine Bow Range, where he had heard there might be winter work at one of the larger cattle operations. The territory was entering one of those particularly harsh winters that old-timers spoke about in hushed tones, the kind of cold that could kill a man in hours if he was caught unprepared. And William had been pushing hard to reach the ranch before the worst of the weather arrived. He had been following an old game trail through a narrow valley, when he spotted the remains of the campfire. Just a circle of stones, with ash so cold it might have been dead for days, and beside it, the crumpled form of a woman who at first glance appeared to be just another casualty of the brutal frontier. William had seen death often enough to recognize it at a distance, but something made him dismount and approach. Perhaps just the ingrained human impulse to confirm what he already suspected. And when he knelt beside the widow and saw the faint rise and fall of her chest beneath the ruined dress, he felt a surge of relief, followed immediately by a far more complicated emotion that he could not quite name. She was alive, but barely. Her skin pale and cold to the touch, her breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. The lonely cowboy had no medical training beyond the basic field medicine all cowboys learned for treating injured cattle and the occasional hurt rider. But he knew hypothermia when he saw it, knew that this woman would be dead within hours if he did not act. He built up the fire first, coaxing flames from the dead ash and adding wood he gathered from the surrounding scrub. Then he wrapped her in his own coat and the 2 blankets he carried in his bedroll, tucking them around her with a gentleness that felt strange to hands more accustomed to rough work. The widow did not wake during any of this, did not respond when he tried to get her to drink water from his canteen, and it was only when he had gotten the fire roaring and positioned her close enough to feel its warmth that her eyes finally opened and fixed on him with that terrible haunted stare that seemed to look through him to some horror he could not see. "Can you tell me your name?" William asked, his voice quiet and careful, and the widow's lips moved, but no sound emerged, just a whisper of breath that carried no words. She tried again, her face contorting with effort, and William realized with a cold certainty that this woman was not choosing silence, but was trapped in it, imprisoned by whatever trauma had brought her to this frozen valley so far from any settlement. "It's all right," he said, though he was not sure if that was true or just something people said in the face of suffering they did not know how to address. "You don't have to talk, but I need to get you somewhere warm, somewhere with shelter and food. The nearest town is 2 days' ride, maybe 3 in this weather, but there's a line shack about 8 hours from here. Can you ride?" The widow shook her head, and William could see in her eyes that she was too weak, that even sitting upright would be beyond her current strength. And so the lonely cowboy made his second choice of the day, the one that would seal both their fates. He fashioned a travois from fallen branches and rope, padding it with his blankets, and with infinite care lifted the silent widow onto it, securing her so she would not slip off during the journey. His horse did not like pulling the extra weight, but William was a skilled enough handler to keep the animal calm, and by mid-morning, they were moving slowly through the valley, the lonely cowboy leading his horse on foot, the silent widow bundled in blankets behind him, both of them heading toward a shelter that might save her life, but would certainly complicate his own in ways he could not yet imagine. The line shack was a crude structure built by cattle ranchers for cowboys to use during the winter range work. Just 4 walls and a roof, with a stone fireplace and a few rough bunks. But to William, it looked like salvation when it finally came into view through the gathering snow. He got the widow inside and settled on one of the bunks, built up the fire until the small space was almost warm, then went back out to tend his horse and bring in his supplies. The storm he had been racing was arriving faster than he had anticipated, the sky darkening to a bruised purple gray, the wind picking up with that particular howl that promised a blizzard that would trap them in this place for days. Inside the shack, William heated water over the fire and tried to get the widow to drink broth made from the dried beef in his supplies, coaxing her like she was an injured animal, patient and persistent until she finally swallowed a few mouthfuls. He could see her struggling to communicate, her hands moving in desperate gestures, her lips forming words that would not come, and the frustration in her eyes was heartbreaking to witness. "Don't push yourself," William said, though he desperately wanted to know what had happened to her, wanted to understand the story behind this silent widow and her presence in the wilderness. "We've got time. The storm's going to keep us here a few days at least." That first night was long and difficult. The lonely cowboy keeping watch over the silent widow, feeding the fire, listening to the wind howl around the fragile walls of the shack, and wondering what he had gotten himself into. He had shared his fire with a stranger, an act that should have been unremarkable, a basic expression of frontier hospitality that was expected of any decent man. But something about the situation felt weighted with consequence, as if he had stepped into a story that was already written, and now he was simply following its inevitable trajectory toward an ending he could not see. The widow's name he learned on the second day, when she had regained enough strength to write with a charred stick on a flat piece of wood, was Eleanor Marsh. She was 31 years old, originally from Ohio, and she had come west 3 years earlier with her husband Daniel, who had died 6 months ago in a mining accident in the mountains north of Laramie. What happened after his death, she could not bring herself to write, her hand shaking so violently when she tried that William stopped her, told her it did not matter, that she was safe now, and that was all that counted. But even as he said the words, the lonely cowboy knew they were a lie, knew that Eleanor Marsh was not safe and might never be safe again, because the West had ways of destroying women who lost their protectors, ways of twisting grief and vulnerability into something shameful and blamed. They stayed in the line shack for 5 days while the storm raged, and during that time, William learned the shape of Eleanor's silence, if not its cause. He learned that she could hear perfectly well, could understand everything he said, but that some barrier had formed between her thoughts and her voice, some trauma so profound that it had severed the connection. He learned that she was stronger than she looked, that beneath the skeletal fragility was a core of will that had kept her alive when death would have been easier. He learned that she had practical skills, that she could cook and mend and manage a camp, and that having someone to care for seemed to give her a purpose that pushed back against whatever darkness haunted her. And the lonely cowboy learned something about himself during those days, learned that the isolation he had chosen was perhaps not as fulfilling as he had convinced himself, that there was a particular kind of peace in sharing space with another person, even if that person could not speak, that the simple act of caring for someone else could fill a void he had not fully acknowledged existed. They fell into an easy routine, William hunting for small game and gathering wood, while Eleanor managed the fire and prepared their meals. And in the evenings, they would sit together in companionable silence, the widow sometimes writing questions or observations that William would answer aloud, creating a lopsided but functional conversation that felt more honest than many exchanges he had had with people who possessed full use of their voices. When the storm finally broke and the sky cleared to a hard, brilliant blue, William knew they had to make a decision about what happened next. He could take Eleanor to the nearest town, turn her over to whatever charity or church organization dealt with destitute women, walk away from this encounter, and return to his lonely life on the ranges. Or he could do something different, something that would require him to abandon the careful isolation he had built around himself and accept responsibility for another person in a way that would change everything. There's a ranch about 30 miles south, William said on the morning they were preparing to leave the line shack. The owner, Clayton Henderson, is a decent man. He's hired me before for seasonal work, and I know he's short-handed this winter. I could ask him for a position that includes room and board, and maybe, if you were willing, he might take you on as well. His wife passed 2 years back, and he's been managing the house himself. Badly, from what I hear. He might appreciate help with cooking and keeping the place in order. Eleanor looked at him with those haunted eyes, and William saw hope war with fear in her expression, saw her calculating the risks of staying with this lonely cowboy against the unknown dangers of being alone again in a territory that had already hurt her in ways he could only guess at. She picked up the charred stick and wrote carefully on the wood. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" "Because," William said, and found he did not have a simple answer, could not reduce his motivations to something easily explained. "Because I found you dying in the cold, and that means something. Because I shared my fire with you, and that creates an obligation. Because maybe I'm tired of being alone, and maybe you need someone who isn't going to ask questions you can't answer. Because it feels like the right thing to do, even if I can't explain why." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. A decision made, and William felt both relief and trepidation because he understood that this choice would bind them together in ways that the West would interpret according to its own harsh logic, would judge according to standards that left no room for nuance or complexity, or the simple truth that sometimes people helped each other for no reason beyond basic human decency. They rode south together through a landscape transformed by snow, the lonely cowboy and the silent widow, and William tried not to think about how they must look to any observer, tried not to imagine the conclusions that would be drawn about a man and a woman traveling alone together, about what their relationship might be, and what sins might be hidden beneath the surface of apparent propriety. They stopped at a creek to water the horse, and William noticed the way Eleanor moved, the careful deliberation that suggested pain she was trying to hide. And he wondered again what horrors she had endured, what violence had stolen her voice and left her so broken that even basic survival seemed like a struggle. The Henderson Ranch came into view on the third day of travel, a sprawling operation with a main house, several outbuildings, and corrals full of cattle waiting out the winter. Clayton Henderson was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with gray shot through his dark hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades working the land. He came out to meet them as they approached, his expression curious and then concerned as he took in Eleanor's condition and the unusual nature of their arrival. "William Tate," Henderson said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man reserving judgment. "Didn't expect to see you this season. Who's your companion?" "This is Eleanor Marsh," William said, keeping his voice steady and matter-of-fact. "I found her in bad shape about a week back. Got her to the line shack during the storm. She's a widow, lost her husband in a mining accident. She can't speak, some kind of trauma, but she's strong and capable, and she's looking for honest work. I'm hoping you might have a place for both of us this winter." Henderson's eyes moved between them, and William could see the man thinking. calculating, trying to determine what was really happening here and what obligations he might be taking on. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, and William was preparing for rejection when Henderson finally nodded slowly. "My wife Ruth passed 2 years back," he said. "The house has been falling apart without her. I could use help with cooking and cleaning, if Mrs. Marsh is willing, and I can always use an extra hand with the cattle, especially someone I know I can trust. But William, I need you to understand what this looks like. A man and a woman, not married, showing up together after traveling alone. People will talk. Let them talk," William said, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. "I shared my fire with someone who needed help. That's all that happened, and all that's going to happen. If people want to make more of it than that, it says more about them than it does about us." Henderson studied them both for another moment. Then his weathered face softened into something that might have been approval or might just have been resignation. "All right then, you can both stay. Mrs. Marsh can have the room off the kitchen. William, you'll bunk with the other hands in the bunkhouse. And if anyone asks, which they will, you tell them the truth straight. Sometimes that's all the armor you need." They settled into life at the Henderson Ranch with surprising ease. The lonely cowboy and the silent widow finding their places in the rhythms of cattle work and domestic management. William discovered that he was wrong about Eleanor's fragility, that she was stronger than her appearance suggested. Capable of long hours of demanding work, she threw herself into managing the house with an intensity that suggested she needed the structure, needed the distraction from whatever memories haunted her. Henderson proved to be a fair employer, and more importantly, a decent man who treated Eleanor with respect and never pressed her about her past or her silence. But the West, as William had feared, was less kind in its judgments. The other ranch hands were careful around Eleanor, treating her with a formal politeness that was in its own way a form of distance, and William could hear the whispers when they thought he was out of earshot, the speculation about what had really happened between him and the widow, the assumptions that no amount of truth could fully dispel. When they rode into the nearest town for supplies, a settlement called Carbon with maybe 300 souls, the stares and whispers were even more pronounced, the judgment more open. William tried to shield Eleanor from the worst of it, tried to position himself between her and the hostile curiosity, but he could see how it affected her, how each stare and whisper seemed to drive her deeper into her silence, seemed to confirm whatever dark thoughts she held about herself and her place in this unforgiving world. The lonely cowboy who had thought he was performing a simple act of mercy was learning that in the West, mercy itself could be interpreted as guilt, that kindness could be mistaken for something darker, and that the price of sharing your fire with the wrong person at the wrong time could be the destruction of both your reputations. Pause here and answer me this. If you found someone dying in the wilderness, would you leave them to their fate rather than face the judgment of people who twist compassion into something shameful? When the West offers you a choice between doing what's right and protecting your reputation, which do you choose? Drop your truth in the comments, because what happens next will show just how high the price of that choice can climb. The real trouble began in February when a circuit preacher named Josiah Blackwell arrived in Carbon for one of his periodic visits to minister to the scattered faithful. Blackwell was a thin, intense man with the kind of moral certainty that left no room for nuance or mercy, the kind of preacher who saw sin everywhere and felt called to root it out with fire. and brimstone rhetoric that played well to frontier communities hungry for clear answers to complicated questions. He heard about the lonely cowboy and the silent widow living at the Henderson Ranch, heard the whispers and speculation, and decided that he had found a perfect target for his next sermon. William and Eleanor heard about it secondhand from one of the other ranch hands who had been in town, heard how Preacher Blackwell had stood in the makeshift church and thundered about sin and fornication, about how a godly community could not tolerate the open scandal of a man and woman living in sin, about how silence itself could be a sign of guilt, because what innocent woman would be struck mute except as divine punishment for unspeakable acts? The preacher never named them directly, but everyone knew who he meant, and by the time the sermon was over, the speculation had hardened into something like certainty in the minds of many townspeople. Henderson tried to defend them, rode into town, and spoke plainly about the truth of the situation, about how William had saved Eleanor's life and how they were both working honestly at his ranch with proper supervision and no impropriety. But his words could not compete with the preacher's rhetoric or the community's hunger for a clear villain to blame for their own discomfort with complexity. Within days, the pressure began to build. People suggesting that Henderson should fire them both, that allowing them to continue working at his ranch was the same as endorsing their sin, that a decent man would not permit such a scandal to continue under his roof. Eleanor felt the weight of it more than William did, felt how the judgment was crushing her, and one evening in late February, she took out her charred stick and wrote on a piece of wood, "I should leave. This is destroying you and you don't deserve it. I'm grateful for everything, but I can't let your kindness ruin your life." William read the words and felt something inside him shift, felt anger rising, not at Eleanor, but at the hypocrisy of a world that would rather see her dead in the wilderness than alive and working honestly, felt rage at the people who hid their cruelty behind the language of morality and righteousness. "No," he said, his voice harder than he intended. "You're not leaving. I shared my fire with you, and that means something to me, even if it means nothing to them. Let them talk. Let them judge. We know the truth, and that's all that matters." But the truth, as William was learning, mattered less than he had believed it would. The truth could not protect them from the weight of communal judgment, could not shield them from the consequences of living in a society that demanded conformity to its narrow definitions of acceptable behavior. The truth was that the lonely cowboy had saved the silent widow's life and asked nothing in return, had treated her with respect and decency, had given her a chance to rebuild when the West had already decided she was disposable. But that truth was too simple, too pure, too devoid of the drama and sin that people wanted to believe in. And so the truth was transformed into something darker in the collective imagination of a territory that forgave violence and brutality more readily than it forgave compassion shown to the wrong person at the wrong time. In March, Preacher Blackwell returned for another sermon, and this time his rhetoric escalated from condemnation to calls for action. He spoke about the need to purge sin from the community, to make it clear that certain behaviors would not be tolerated, to demonstrate to the wider world that this was a godly settlement that upheld proper standards of morality. The language was careful, never quite crossing the line into explicit incitement, but the message was clear enough, and William felt a cold certainty settle in his gut that something worse than whispers was coming. It came on a clear, cold night In mid-March, when 6 men rode out to the Henderson Ranch, their faces covered with bandanas, their intentions masked behind claims of righteous action, they found William in the barn, tending to a sick calf, and they dragged him out into the yard while Eleanor watched in horror from the house window, while Henderson himself was held at gunpoint and forced to witness what these men called justice. They beat William methodically, professionally, the kind of beating designed to hurt without killing, to send a message without creating a corpse that might complicate the narrative. And while they beat him, they shouted about sin and fornication, about how a man who would defile a widow was no better than an animal, about how this was what happened to those who refused to respect community standards. Eleanor broke her silence that night, though not in the way anyone expected. She did not scream or cry or beg for mercy. Instead, she threw open the door and walked into the yard, placing herself between William and his attackers. And when one of the men raised his hand to strike her, she looked at him with those haunted eyes and opened her mouth, and a sound emerged that was not quite a word, but was full of such anguish and rage that it stopped the men in their tracks. It was the sound of 11 months of silence breaking, the sound of all the horrors she had endured, finding voice in a single inarticulate cry that seemed to echo across the frozen landscape and demand acknowledgement. The men hesitated, caught between their momentum of violence and the shock of this disruption. And in that moment of hesitation, Eleanor found more words, her voice rusty and broken, but audible. "He saved my life," she said, each word seeming to cost her immense effort. "I was dying, and he shared his fire. That is all. That is everything. If you have to punish someone, punish me, but leave him alone." Her voice shocked them more than any plea or prayer could have. Shocked them because it broke the narrative they had constructed, complicated the story they had told themselves about the silent widow and the lonely cowboy. One of the men lowered his hand, stepped back, and William could see doubt creeping into the faces behind the bandanas. "She's a witch," someone muttered. "Demons made her mute, and now demons give her voice." But the accusation had no force behind it. Felt like desperation rather than conviction. "Get out," Henderson said, his voice cold and steady, despite the gun still pointed at him. "You've done your damage. Now get off my land before I remember each of your faces and your horses, and go to the territorial marshal with what I know." The men retreated, mounting their horses and riding off into the darkness. And William lay in the dirt bleeding, while Eleanor knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder, her newly recovered voice whispering words of comfort and apology. Henderson helped them inside, sent one of the other hands for the doctor, and stayed with them through the long night while William's injuries were tended, and while Eleanor slowly, haltingly, began to tell her story. For the first time since she had lost her voice nearly a year before, her husband Daniel had died in the mining accident, just as she had written. But what she had not been able to explain was what happened after. The mining company refused to pay his wages or provide any support for his widow, leaving Eleanor destitute and alone in a rough camp where women without male protection were considered fair game for any kind of abuse. She had been assaulted by 3 men who worked the mine, attacked in broad daylight while other miners watched and did nothing. And the trauma of that violence had stolen her voice, had locked her screams inside her throat until they became a permanent silence. She had wandered for months, begging and stealing and barely surviving, until that November morning when the cold and starvation and cumulative trauma had finally brought her to the point of death, where William found her beside the dead campfire. "I didn't want to bring my shame into your life," Eleanor said, her voice still broken but stronger now. Each word an act of will. "I thought if I stayed silent, if I just worked and kept my head down, maybe no one would notice me. But the West doesn't forget. The West doesn't forgive. And now you've paid the price for my existence." William, his face swollen and bruised but his eyes clear, reached out and took her hand. "You have no shame," he said firmly. "What happened to you was not your fault. And I don't regret sharing my fire with you. Not for a second. Not even now." The beating changed something in the community, though not in the way the attackers had intended. Henderson made good on his threat, rode to the territorial marshal, and provided detailed descriptions of the horses and gear he had seen. And within 2 weeks, 3 of the 6 men were arrested and charged with assault. The trial was a brief affair, complicated by the fact that 2 of the accused were prominent members of the Carbon community. But Henderson's testimony was unshakable, and Eleanor's newly recovered voice, telling her story of assault and abandonment by the mining company, created a counter-narrative that some people found more convincing than Preacher Blackwell's rhetoric about sin and judgment. The men were found guilty and sentenced to 6 months in the territorial prison, and the verdict split Carbon down the middle between those who believed justice had been done and those who felt that good men had been punished for trying to uphold community standards. Preacher Blackwell left town shortly after, moving on to new settlements where his brand of moral certainty might find more receptive audiences, and his departure seemed to release some of the pressure that had been building around William and Eleanor. But the damage was done, the price paid, and both the lonely cowboy and the silent widow understood that they could never fully escape the judgment of a West that had decided their simple act of sharing a fire was something darker and more dangerous than it ever actually was. Eleanor's voice, never fully recovered, remained rough and hesitant, and there were still days when the trauma locked her back into silence. But she had reclaimed enough of it to tell her story, to defend herself and the man who had saved her life. William's injuries healed slowly, leaving scars that ached in cold weather and would ache for the rest of his life, physical reminders of the price he had paid for compassion. He stayed at the Henderson Ranch through the following spring and summer, and Eleanor stayed as well, and over time, they became fixtures there. The man who would not abandon a stranger, and the woman who had found her voice in defense of him. They never became more than friends, never crossed the lines that the community had accused them of already crossing. But their friendship was deep and genuine, built on shared trauma and mutual respect, and the understanding that sometimes the most radical act in an unforgiving world is simply showing kindness to someone who needs it. Clayton Henderson passed away 5 years later and left his ranch to William and Eleanor jointly, a final gesture of respect from a man who had stood by them when the West demanded their destruction. They ran the ranch together as partners, building it into one of the most successful operations in that part of Wyoming territory. And they never forgot the price they had paid or the lessons they had learned about mercy and judgment. The West never fully forgave them for the crime of sharing a fire, for the sin of caring about a stranger's survival more than they cared about public opinion. The story of the lonely cowboy and the silent widow became a cautionary tale, told in settlements across the territory, used by preachers and moral guardians as an example of what happens when people step outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior. But the story also became something else for those who knew the truth, became a different kind of tale about courage and compassion, and the terrible price both can demand in a world that values conformity over kindness. Eleanor Marsh and William Tate lived long lives, died within months of each other in 1918, and were buried side by side on the ranch they had built together. Their headstones carried no special inscriptions, just names and dates. But those who knew their story understood that beneath that simple earth lay two people who had chosen mercy over judgment, who had paid the price the West demanded, and who had never once regretted the choice they made on that cold November morning when a lonely cowboy shared his fire with a silent widow, and everything changed forever. If this story of impossible choices and unbearable prices moved you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what you would have done in William's place, because the frontier has endless stories of people who chose compassion over safety and paid dearly for it. And I'll be bringing you more of these tales of moral courage in the coming weeks. So subscribe now and never miss another story of the West that tests everything we think we know about right and wrong.